stability for China, and for his tenure. That's what President Xi Jinping is seeking as his party, the National People's Congress, kicked off its annual two-week policy meeting in Beijing. There were no surprises when Premier Li Keqiang announced the country's economic projections. Beijing is keeping its growth target for this year at around 6.5%, despite beating the same target last year. But for the first time since 2012, it's cutting its budget deficit target, a decision analysts say signals China's commitment to controlling debt. It wants to spend more on military upgrades, boosting defense spending by 8% from 2017 to $175 billion. The announcement drew quick response from its neighbors, with Japanese and Taiwanese officials warning the decision could increase tension in the region. Back in the Great Hall, the Chinese government's reaction to US President Donald Trump's recent steel and aluminium tariff hikes was muted. Instead, Li drummed up the country's push to promote what it calls win-win economic cooperation by opening up its economy.
We must remain committed to the general principle of pursuing progress while ensuring stability and to the new development philosophy. We must work hard to reform and open up further, explore new ideas on and improve macro regulation, and promote changes in quality, efficiency, and growth drivers.
High quality and sustainable growth is what China is after. And it's keeping up the fight against pollution by promising to cut more steel and coal production capacity this year. Besides charting economic goals, the ruling party is set to endorse nominations for key positions to ensure a smooth leadership transition. But any changing of the guards in future could exclude Xi. By the end of the marathon meeting, the Chinese parliament is set to approve a proposal to scrap limits on presidential terms, which paves the way for Xi to chair meetings like this beyond 2023. Laila Humairah, TRT World.
Joining me now from London is John Hemmings. He's the director of the Asia Studies Centre of the Henry Jackson Society. Great to have you again on the show. Look, we've been hearing from Chinese leaders over the last few years that they want this high-quality growth. They want to rein in debt. They want to rein in pollution. None of that is really new. What has really stood out for you at this year's NPC?
Well, of course, the big news has been that Xi will consolidate his meteoric rise to power by getting rid of his term limitations. Technically, he would have to have finished by 2023. So, you know, we saw already he's released that he's going to do this, and the People's Congress will ratify that. And so that will be the most important thing. And then, of course, the other thing that people are speaking about is the ever-increasing defense spending that China has this year, with a slightly lack of transparency in terms of release.
The Chinese government, of course, says that as a percentage of their GDP, they're just catching up with the US in terms of military spending. But look, let's talk about the US in relation to China. We've heard the reaction from Chinese leaders to Trump's threats to impose these tariffs on steel and aluminium. But what do you think is the mood amongst the rank-and-file delegates at the NPC and perhaps amongst ordinary business people in China? Do they have the appetite to go toe-to-toe with the US in a trade war?
I mean, this is the question. I think this is the question that a lot of people in the China watching community are doing for the next year or so. It's really, forgive me, it's two questions. The first question is, can China go back to this kind of centralized party-led model in which state-owned enterprises become more dominant, in which it looks more like a communist socialist state than it was a capitalist socialist state? And how does that look to its GDP to debt spending ratio? And then the other one, of course, is, you're right, absolutely right. How do they go toe-to-toe with the Americans in this? We saw this year the national security strategy of the United States label both China and Russia as kind of revisionist powers. The Americans, to some extent, are annoyed with the trade balance. I think the trade balance was the highest it's ever been, the surplus between China and the US this year. Also, there's a lot of criticism of China's steel dumping. But you know, the US and China are so closely interlinked economically, it's hard to know where they can go on this. So those two questions, I think, are going to be pivotal for both Washington and Beijing this year.
Yeah, is one possible way for China to do this to scale back its purchases of US treasuries, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. That would be a first form of punishment. But then they can also, for example, start punishing American companies that want access to the Chinese market. You know, we see Facebook and Google and other high-tech firms still trying to get into what is a hugely untapped market for them. But I think, you know, with Peter Navarro, who is quite a China hawk on the Trump team, he's been in the background when Steve Bannon was running around and Jared Kushner. And Navarro has quietly risen through the ranks in the White House and become more powerful, they say, and has more the ear of the president now. And so he's very critical of how China is, you know, how its capitalism is working. It's gaming the system, he alleges.
John, a very quick final question. What are the possible consequences for foreign investment in China once Xi Jinping makes himself leader for life? Is it going to be positive or negative?
Well, I would hope that it would be positive, but the positive signs are not there in actual fact. We've seen Made in China 2025 essentially is pushing Chinese firms out to try to get intellectual property. We will see them still holding the Chinese market very close to Western investment firms. So if you don't have that IP they want, I think you'll find it very hard to access.
OK, we'll leave it there. John Hemmings of the Henry Jackson Society in London, thank you very much.